In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Peace and blessings be upon you all. In a prosperous kingdom, blessed with wisdom and justice, there once lived a man whose name was well known across the land and beyond, Abu Nawas. Though many knew him as a court jester or a witty comedian, those who had truly encountered him understood that he was far more than that. Abu Nawas was a man of sharp intellect, unmatched in his cleverness and ability to turn even the most complicated debate into a simple truth. His name was respected not only in his own land but also in neighboring countries. Even scholars, poets, and scientists admired the uniqueness of his mind. One ordinary morning, the peaceful halls of the grand palace of Caliph Harun al-Rashid were stirred by surprising news. A letter had arrived, bearing the seal of a foreign land. Its contents announced the arrival of a well-known figure, Professor Gregorius, a highly acclaimed scientist and philosopher from a distant country. This professor, however, was not just any visitor. He was a declared atheist, a man who rejected the existence of any divine being. Famous for his fiery arguments and bold confrontations, Professor Gregorius had spent years traveling from land to land, challenging scholars, debating philosophers, and questioning religious leaders. His sole mission was to disprove the belief in a creator. Until now, no one had been able to sway him. No debate had been enough to make him even consider the possibility of a divine power. Now, here he was in Baghdad, standing in the heart of the Islamic world, and his demand was clear. "I want to debate with the wisest man in this kingdom," he declared boldly, his voice echoing through the halls of the palace. The advisors and ministers of King Harun al-Rashid looked at each other. Who could possibly take on such a challenge? Without hesitation, the king ordered his most trusted advisors to summon none other than Abu Nawas. A few moments later, Abu Nawas strolled into the palace hall, not dressed in scholarly robes or carrying heavy books of philosophy, but with a simple bag of peanuts slung over his shoulder. With a calm smile, he sat down in front of the esteemed professor and began peeling the peanuts one by one, munching on them casually as though the entire matter were of no great concern. One of the ministers, clearly annoyed by this laid-back behavior, snapped at him. "Abu Nawas, you were called here to face a serious challenge, not to sit and eat peanuts." Abu Nawas, completely unfazed, smiled at the minister and responded in a calm, composed tone. "This is part of my intellectual preparation." Then, with a generous gesture, he offered some peanuts to Professor Gregorius. The professor frowned and waved them away. "I didn't come here for snacks. I want to see if you can actually prove that God exists. Can you do that, with logic and reason?" Abu Nawas leaned back slightly and looked the professor in the eye. "Before we begin, I have a question for you. Are you truly here in search of the truth? Or is your only goal to win this debate?" "I believe in reason and science," the professor answered sternly. "If you can prove your claim through logic that satisfies my mind, I will accept it." Upon hearing this, Abu Nawas clapped his hands a few times and exclaimed cheerfully, "Excellent! Then allow me to present proof that you will not be able to deny. But patience, Professor, let's make this an interesting experience." King Harun al-Rashid and his ministers watched with great curiosity. They knew Abu Nawas well. He had a reputation for turning even the toughest situations to his advantage, using nothing more than his wit and logic. The room began to fill with people, scholars, courtiers, and commoners alike, all eager to witness what was expected to be a historic moment. The magnificent hall of the palace was buzzing with energy. The king himself took his seat, eyes locked on Abu Nawas. Professor Gregorius, wearing a long robe adorned with symbols of science and academia, sat confidently, his arms crossed and a mocking smile on his lips. He looked at Abu Nawas and said, "I've challenged countless scholars. None have succeeded. I hope you're not just another entertainer pretending to be a philosopher." Abu Nawas, standing tall now, replied gently, "I don't boast about what I know, Professor. I prefer to let logic speak for itself. So let's begin, not with heavy words, but with a little experiment. The professor raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. This is a scientific debate, not a game. Abu Nawas nodded. That's true. But sometimes, even simple games can reveal the deepest truths. He turned to the guards and requested, please gather some inanimate objects, anything that cannot think or move by itself. Stones, pieces of wood, jugs, even fabric. The king gave his approval with a nod, and in no time, a variety of objects were placed on the table before Abu Nawas. Abu Nawas picked up a stone and carefully placed it in the middle of the table. He then looked at the professor and asked, Tell me, Professor, can this stone move on its own? The professor gave a slight chuckle. Of course not. Only living things have the ability to move by themselves. Abu Nawas nodded thoughtfully. Agreed. Now, if I throw this stone at someone and it hits them, did the stone move on its own? The professor replied. No, it moved because you threw it. Exactly. Abu Nawas said with a wide smile. So we agree that something cannot move unless there is something or someone causing it to move? That's simply the law of nature, the professor answered, shifting slightly in his seat. Very well, Abu Nawas said. He picked up a piece of wood and dropped it to the floor. It hit the ground with a dull thud. Same thing here. Unless someone picks it up and throws it, it remains still. He paused and then leaned in slightly. Now think about this, Professor. The world itself, the earth, the stars, the planets, the moon, all of it moves. But what moves them? Who causes the motion? Who causes the creation, the balance, the life? Surely, something cannot come into existence from nothing and then organize itself in such perfect harmony without an intelligent force behind it. For the first time, the professor did not immediately respond. The room grew silent. Whispers began to spread among the audience. The king leaned forward. Ministers exchanged glances. Even the scholars were intrigued by the simplicity and power of Abu Nawas' argument. Professor Gregorius's confident smile had now faded. He looked thoughtful, perhaps even slightly troubled. Yet he tried to stand his ground. There are natural laws, he said after a long pause. Gravity, evolution, chemical reactions, these explain everything. But who created those laws? Abu Nawas asked softly. Who ensured that every element in the universe follows a precise order? Laws do not come from chaos, they are designed. And every design points to a designer. The professor, still seated in the palace hall, scoffed at Abu Nawas' reasoning. There is no need for a god to make all these things happen, he said stubbornly. Natural laws govern the universe. Everything exists because of these principles. Abu Nawas let out a soft chuckle, amused by the professor's certainty. Ah, Professor, he said calmly, you put so much faith in the laws of nature. But tell me, if these laws truly govern everything so perfectly, then who created those laws in the first place? Did they just appear out of thin air? Can a law create itself? Professor Gregorius shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable for the first time. His confident posture began to fade. He tried to steer the discussion elsewhere. I still believe that everything can be explained through science. Evolution, gravity, the laws of physics, they provide all the answers. Abu Nawas took a slow, deep breath and walked over to the table in front of him. He picked up a jug of water and gently poured it into a glass, the sound echoing in the silent room. Then he turned to the professor once more. Professor, please tell me, where does this water come from? Without hesitation, Gregorius responded. From the river. From rainfall. It's all part of the water cycle. Abu Nawas nodded, as if agreeing. Good. And who created the cycle? Who established the law that causes water to evaporate, rise into the sky, form clouds, and fall again as rain? The professor fell silent for a moment. He knew that science explained how the cycle worked, But Abu Nawas wasn't asking how. He was asking why. The difference pierced deep. Abu Nawas took a step closer and continued, his voice calm yet firm. Science explains the process, yes. But it does not explain the origin. You can describe the movement of water, but not who made the water itself. You can describe how rain falls, but not why such a system exists at all. The audience murmured in agreement. King Harun al-Rashid smiled with satisfaction as he watched Abu Nawas dismantle the professor's argument layer by layer. Professor Gregorius began to sweat under the weight of the moment. He wasn't used to this kind of reasoning, simple yet piercing. He tried to push back. If your God exists, he said sharply, then who created him? Surely everything must have a creator. That would mean even God was created. The room grew tense. The audience leaned in. Even the guards held their breath. Abu Nawas smiled faintly and walked over to the table again. He picked up a blank piece of parchment and held it up for all to see. Professor, he said, if we leave this paper on the table for 100 years, will it write something on its own? Of course not, Gregorius replied with a scoff. It's just paper. It can't write anything by itself. Abu Nawas nodded. Exactly. Now consider this world, which is infinitely more complex than this piece of paper. Think about its mountains, its rivers, its skies, its living creatures, all functioning in balance and harmony. If a blank page can't write itself, how could this entire universe come into existence without a creator? Professor Gregorius was speechless. His eyes fell on the paper in Abu Nawas' hand, and he suddenly found it difficult to look away. For the first time in his life, doubt crept into his heart, not because someone had overpowered him with heavy philosophy, but because the truth had come to him in its simplest, most undeniable form. The silence stretched long. Finally, with a flushed face, the professor stood up. His voice was no longer arrogant or proud. I need time, he said loudly, almost defensively. Abu Nawas, ever composed, nodded with understanding. Of course, Professor. Truth cannot be forced upon anyone. But I believe that if you continue to search with a sincere heart, the truth will find you. Professor Gregorius left the hall with heavy steps. Gone was the pride he had carried when he entered. His shoulders were low, his head bowed in thought. The king turned to Abu Nawas and asked, Do you think he will change? Abu Nawas smiled with deep insight. Truth has knocked at his door, Your Majesty. Now it is up to him whether he opens it, or continues to live in denial. The audience erupted in applause, but the story was far from over. That night, the palace was filled with a strange quiet. Though no music played and no banquets were held, the minds of many were alive with thought, especially that of Professor Gregorius. Alone in his room, he sat staring at the same blank piece of paper Abu Nawas had shown him. He held it between his fingers, turning it over and over again. The simplicity of the metaphor haunted him. How can this world exist without a creator? He muttered to himself. Just like paper cannot write itself. His hands trembled. He crushed the paper in frustration and threw it to the floor. He took a deep breath and muttered angrily. No! I won't be defeated by a court clown's word games. But the more he tried to deny it, the louder the question echoed in his mind. He couldn't escape it. The logic was too clear. And for the first time, science felt limited. Elsewhere in the palace, Abu Nawas sat calmly on the porch, sipping a warm cup of tea and enjoying the night breeze. King Harun al-Rashid joined him, curiosity still shining in his eyes. What do you think, Abu Nawas? The king asked gently. What will the professor do now? Abu Nawas smiled knowingly. People who believe they are the smartest often take the longest to accept the truth. Right now, he is fighting not with me, but with himself. The real battle is within. The king nodded thoughtfully. Tomorrow, he said, we shall see how that battle ends. Abu Nawas laughed softly. Your Majesty, this is not the end. In fact, it is only the beginning. As dawn approached, Professor Gregorius quietly left the palace. No one noticed him depart, not even the guards. He wasn't running away. He had set off on a journey. He visited nearby towns and cities, meeting with philosophers, scientists, alchemists, and even magicians. His goal? To find someone who could help him refute Abu Nawas' arguments. He wasn't ready to accept defeat. He needed to prove that reason alone could stand without belief in a creator. But in every city he visited, the answers he received only deepened his confusion. One wise man told him, "Professor, you seek to deny the existence of God, but you are the one searching for answers now. Isn't that a sign?" Another scholar remarked, "We can explain how things happen. But the why? That belongs to something beyond science." Day by day, Professor Gregorius found himself surrounded by words that sounded like Abu Nawas. Different people, same reasoning. He began to realize something he had long ignored: science explains the mechanics of the universe, but not its purpose. But each response only deepened Professor Gregorius' confusion. Though he received answers from many scholars, philosophers, and even illusionists, none could give him the certainty he longed for. One elderly magician from a distant village looked at him kindly and said, "I can deceive the eyes of men with tricks and illusions, but I can never deceive an honest heart seeking the truth." That statement lingered in Gregorius' mind. His journey, meant to strengthen his disbelief, had only exposed the cracks in it. The more he searched, the more lost he felt. Days passed, and his once unshakable confidence began to waver. Eventually, tired and disheartened, he found himself at the edge of a quiet city. There, standing alone near a small, time-worn mosque, was an old man reading from a weathered book. Driven by the last threads of hope, Gregorius dismounted his horse and approached the man. "O wise elder," he asked softly, "I am searching for an answer. Does God truly exist?" The grandfather gently closed his book and looked up with kind eyes. A warm smile touched his wrinkled face. "My son," he said, "when you are hungry, do you not search for food? And when you are thirsty, do you not look for water?" The professor nodded slowly. "Yes, of course." "Then tell me," the old man continued, "when your heart is restless, what are you looking for?" Gregorius didn't respond. His throat tightened. His heart, already heavy, grew heavier. I want certainty," he whispered. The grandfather nodded with wisdom only years can bring. "Then go back to the palace. The one who can help you understand what you're truly seeking is there." With a soul torn between reason and revelation, Professor Gregorius mounted his horse and began the journey back. But what he did not know was that someone had been secretly following him throughout his travels, someone who had a different agenda. Back at the palace, Abu Nawas was preparing for what he thought would be a second meeting with the professor, perhaps the conclusion of their debate. But suddenly, a royal messenger came running toward him, panic in his eyes. "Abu Nawas!" the man gasped. "There is danger! Professor Gregorius has been kidnapped!" Abu Nawas' heart sank. "What? Who would dare do such a thing?" "We don't know," the messenger panted. "He was taken and rushed toward a cave near the borderlands. It all happened so fast. No one saw the captors clearly." When King Harun al-Rashid was informed, his face turned grave. "Who dares kidnap my guest under my protection?" he thundered. Without delay, Abu Nawas assembled a team of loyal guards and set out toward the cave. Determined to save the professor, he led the way through rugged terrain until they reached the shadowy entrance of the cave. Inside, in the dim light of flickering torches, Professor Gregorius sat tied to a chair. His hands were bound, and his face showed signs of confusion and fear. Standing before him was a tall, cloaked figure, face hidden, eyes burning with contempt. "I will not let you fall to Abu Nawas' tricks," the man hissed. You cannot abandon us. You cannot change. Gregorius blinked, struggling to comprehend. Who are you? The man laughed coldly. Someone who has worked in the shadows, ensuring the truth stays buried. If you change your beliefs, everything we built will fall apart. You don't want me to find the truth? Gregorius asked, voice trembling. If you accept God, the man said darkly, then science will be forced to kneel before faith. We cannot allow that. People will question. Systems will collapse. Control will be lost. In that moment, something dawned on Gregorius. So all this time, I wasn't seeking truth. I was protecting my ego, he murmured. The cloaked man raised a dagger. Then it's too late. But just before the blow could be struck, a voice echoed from the cave entrance, confident, sharp, unmistakable. Oh, so it turns out the truth does scare some people after all. It was Abu Nawas. He stood tall, arms folded, with the king's guards behind him, torches lighting their path. The cloaked man froze. Abu Nawas stepped forward, eyes locked on the kidnapper. You've built your entire life on a lie, haven't you? And now you're terrified of losing your illusion of control. The man spat at the ground. You think I fear you? But before he could act, the soldiers of King Harun al-Rashid surrounded him, swords drawn. Release the professor, one of the commanders ordered. Or you will spend the rest of your life in the palace dungeon. Defeated, the cloaked man dropped his weapon. Gregorius was untied and helped to his feet. As he stepped out of the cave, he turned to Abu Nawas, eyes brimming with tears. Abu Nawas, he whispered, voice choked. I need to speak with you. I think I've found the answer. But Abu Nawas shook his head gently. Not yet, Professor. You've only just started your journey. Back at the palace, the two men sat facing each other in a quiet study filled with ancient scrolls and books. The air was still, heavy with the weight of discovery. Professor Gregorius' face was calmer now, but his eyes carried a depth of conflict. I've searched far and wide, he said softly. I thought I was seeking to disprove God, but all I found were questions I never dared to ask before. Abu Nawas smiled knowingly. That is the nature of truth, Professor. The closer you get to it, the more it humbles you. Truth doesn't always come with loud declarations. Sometimes it arrives in silence and reflection. King Harun al-Rashid, who had been observing from nearby, now stepped forward. So tell me, Professor, he asked, are you ready to admit the truth? Gregorius inhaled deeply. I can no longer deny that there's something greater than science, something far beyond equations and logic. But before he could finish, a loud noise echoed from outside the palace. The doors swung open, and a guard entered urgently. Your Majesty, he announced. A group of foreign scholars has arrived. They demand to meet Professor Gregorius. The professor's face turned pale. He stood abruptly. They've come for me. Abu Nawas raised an eyebrow. Who are they, Professor? Gregorius swallowed hard. They're scientists I used to work with. They won't let me change. To them, this would be betrayal. The visitors were allowed into the hall. 5 men entered, dressed in long academic robes. Their expressions were stiff, almost cold. There was no warmth in their eyes, only suspicion. Their leader, an elderly man with a flowing white beard, stepped forward. He looked at Gregorius with steel in his gaze. Gregory, he said bluntly, we've heard you've begun to doubt. Tell us, is it true? Gregorius hesitated. But before he could speak, Abu Nawas broke the silence with his calm tone. Is there anything wrong with seeking truth? He asked. Is it wrong if someone asks questions that lead to clarity? The white-bearded man narrowed his eyes at Abu Nawas. You must be the cause of this confusion. Gregory has been part of our circle for decades. If he changes now, it is not only a betrayal of reason, but of everything we've built. Gregorius sighed. I haven't harmed anyone. I've simply come to see that the world is more than just formulas and theories. There's a greater design, a deeper meaning. The elder scientist leaned closer and whispered coldly. If you continue on this path, you know what will happen. Gregorius was visibly shaken. Abu Nawas saw the fear in his eyes and gently guided the conversation. Professor, he said softly, you always believed in logic. Then let me ask you one final question. Gregorius looked up. Abu Nawas continued. Answer me honestly, not for them, not for me. Just for yourself. Do you truly, deep within, still believe that God does not exist? The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Professor Gregorius. He closed his eyes, drew in a long breath, and then slowly opened them. Professor Gregorius took a deep breath and spoke the words that silenced the entire hall. I can no longer deny it. This universe has a creator. A wave of shock swept across the room. Gasps were heard from every corner. The foreign scientists who had come for him stood frozen in disbelief. Then, in a cold voice filled with betrayal, the leader of the group said, You've truly become our enemy, Gregorius. If you no longer stand with us, you cannot exist among us. Before anyone could react, the old man reached into his robe and pulled out a hidden dagger. But Abu Nawas was quicker. He grabbed the teapot from the table and flung it with perfect aim. It struck the old scientist squarely on the head. The man staggered backward, and the dagger fell from his hand with a metallic clang. Instantly, the palace guards leapt into action. They apprehended the old man, while the remaining 4 scientists were also restrained. It was then that the gravity of the moment hit Professor Gregorius. Breathing heavily, he clutched his chest, shaken. They truly wanted to kill me, just for changing my mind. Abu Nawas placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Sometimes, Professor, it's not the truth that people fear, it's losing the control they built upon lies. King Harun al-Rashid rose from his throne, fury blazing in his eyes. What do you want me to do with these traitors, Abu Nawas? Abu Nawas looked toward Gregorius and said gently, Let him decide. It is his right. All eyes turned to the professor. He looked at the people who had once been his trusted colleagues, men with whom he had shared discoveries, ideas, and years of camaraderie. And now they had tried to end his life. With a long, sorrowful sigh he spoke. I do not seek revenge. But I also cannot allow them to hurt others as they tried to hurt me. Let them be exiled from Baghdad. Let them go where their hatred cannot reach anyone else. The king nodded solemnly. So be it. From this day forward, they are exiled and forbidden from ever setting foot in this city again. The room slowly began to settle. The tension dissipated, though the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Professor Gregorius turned to Abu Nawas, his voice quiet and contemplative. I never thought my life could change so drastically, he said. All my years of studying science, and it was a few simple questions that shook me to my core. Abu Nawas laughed softly. Truth, my friend, often wears a humble robe. It doesn't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes it whispers, but it shakes mountains. Gregorius looked upward at the ceiling of the grand hall. His eyes were filled with deep reflection. I still have many questions, he admitted. But there's one thing I'm sure of. What is that? Abu Nawas asked. I want to know more about Islam. A broad, satisfied smile lit Abu Nawas' face. Then let us begin the real journey. After the incident that had shaken the very walls of the Baghdad palace, calmness returned. But in the heart of Professor Gregorius, a storm still swirled. That night, he sat alone in the palace garden, gazing at the starlit sky. The stars seemed brighter, the wind gentler, as if the world had taken on a new meaning. He thought of his debates with Abu Nawas, the long journey across cities, the betrayal of friends, and the moment he admitted the existence of God. All of it had brought him here, to a garden under the stars, wondering what came next. Suddenly, soft footsteps approached. "Still thinking, Professor?" came a familiar voice. Abu Nawas sat beside him, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. Gregorius accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "I spent years in science," he said, "believing everything could be explained by logic. But today I realized there is something far greater than human reasoning." Abu Nawas smiled. "That is the path to truth, Professor. It doesn't end at reason, it begins there. If your heart is now open, then it's time to seek deeper understanding." Gregorius stared into his cup, his voice heavy with sincerity. "How can I ever be completely sure?" Abu Nawas looked at him with gentle wisdom. "You've already seen signs, but true belief doesn't come from the mind alone. It must also come from the heart. Islam isn't just to be thought about, it must be felt, lived, and experienced." There was silence between them. Only the soft rustling of the wind filled the air. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, Professor Gregorius said, "I want to try." The next morning, for the first time in his life, Professor Gregorius entered a mosque. He stood quietly at the entrance of the palace's prayer area, watching as worshippers performed their ablution, washing themselves in preparation for prayer. He observed the way they prayed, bowing and prostrating in complete submission. Abu Nawas stood beside him and explained, "In Islam, we don't worship with the mind alone. We worship with our hearts, with our words, and even with our bodies. Every movement in prayer has meaning. It's a complete surrender to the Creator." Gregorius nodded slowly. "I want to learn." And so, his journey began. He learned how to perform wudu. He learned how to stand in prayer, how to bow, and how to prostrate. He studied the Qur'an in translation, asked questions about the prophets, the stories of past nations, and the concept of Tawhid, the oneness of God. But his journey was not without struggle. Many nights, he sat in deep conversation with Abu Nawas, exploring doubts, discussing verses, and reflecting on divine wisdom. Until one night, after reading the English translation of the Qur'an, he closed the book, and tears filled his eyes. "I've found it," he whispered. "What I've been searching for all my life." Then, with a heart full of conviction and peace, Professor Gregorius uttered the Shahada. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." He recited it before Abu Nawas and King Harun al-Rashid. The room fell silent in awe, then filled with emotion. Tears rolled down his cheeks as if years of burden had been lifted from his soul. "I feel light," he said, smiling through tears. "As though the weight I've carried all my life has finally been removed." Abu Nawas embraced him warmly. "Welcome, my friend, to the light of truth." And so, Professor Gregorius, once a staunch atheist and man of reason, became a believer, a Muslim. His story became living proof that Islam does not contradict reason but completes it. It shows that faith and intellect are not enemies, but companions in the search for truth. This is the story of a man who set out to disprove God, and found him instead. What can we learn from this story? That no journey toward truth is ever in vain. That sincere questions lead to profound answers. That those who search with open hearts will be guided, no matter how far they've wandered. And that Allah, the most merciful, never turns away one who seeks Him with sincerity. Thank you for joining us on this young Muslim outsmarted an arrogant atheist professor, with just a glass of water. A young Muslim man left an entire auditorium speechless, silencing an arrogant atheist professor with nothing but calm logic and a simple glass of water. At first, the professor had laughed, confident he could dismantle the young man's faith in 5 minutes. But what happened next shocked everyone present. By the end of the debate, the professor and his followers were left in stunned silence, some even dropping to the floor in prostration. Let's dive into this powerful story, and may those who subscribe be blessed with smooth paths in life. The large lecture hall was packed. Every seat was filled, with people squeezed shoulder to shoulder. Most of the audience were intellectuals and atheist thinkers, many of them longtime admirers of Professor Joshua Watkins, a man known for his sharp mind and infamous for dismantling religious arguments with ease. That night, Professor Watkins stood confidently at the center of the stage. A mocking smile played on his lips as his eyes scanned the room with bold arrogance. Then, in his usual booming voice, he issued a challenge he had often repeated. "Is there a Muslim in this room brave enough to prove the existence of God?" The room went still. His voice echoed like a taunt. "Come forward," he said, "and I guarantee you'll leave without your faith tonight." A wave of unease swept through the hall. Some whispered quietly, others lowered their heads, hesitant to face Watkins, the man who had defeated so many before. From the corner, a few scoffs were heard, sneers from the professor's loyal followers. They were certain that no Muslim present had the courage, or the intellect, to face the most brutal atheist in debate. But suddenly, a hand rose from the crowd. A young man, 24 years old, stood up calmly. His gaze locked onto the professor's with quiet strength. His name was Abdurrahman. The audience burst into laughter. Heads shook in disbelief. To them, this looked like a lamb walking into the lion's den. A young man with no degree, no reputation, and no debate experience was going to challenge the great Joshua Watkins? It sounded absurd. Watkins smirked, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the young man like he was a child trying to act brave. "A young Muslim," he scoffed. "With no academic title, no philosophical background, and no scientific credentials wants to debate me? You don't need to be a professor to understand the truth." Abdurrahman replied calmly. The room fell silent once more. No one expected such a steady, confident answer. Watkins raised an eyebrow, now slightly intrigued. "Very well," he said, spreading his arms theatrically. "Let's see what you've got. Tonight a young Muslim will try to defend his faith." Abdurrahman made his way to the stage and sat across from Watkins in the chair prepared for him. The spotlight shone directly on the two of them. Every eye in the hall was fixed on the stage. This was more than just a debate, it was a showdown between belief and ego, between truth and arrogance. Some of the audience still wore smug smiles, fully expecting another show of intellectual slaughter at the professor's hands. Watkins leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Let's start with a simple question," he said in a condescending tone. "If your God truly exists, show him to me. Where is he?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. It was a familiar tactic, one Watkins had used countless times before to trap his opponents. After all, no one could show God, right? Without blinking, Abdurrahman calmly reached for the glass of water sitting on the table. He lifted it high for everyone to see. "Professor," he said, "do you believe in the existence of human reason?" Watkins frowned. "Of course," he replied quickly. "Can you show it to me?" Watkins paused. "I'm not asking you to show me the results of reason," Abdurrahman continued. "I'm asking you to show me reason itself, its shape, its color, its form." Watkins leaned back slightly, now realizing where this was going. "That's impossible," he admitted. "Exactly," Abdurrahman said, nodding. "We can't see reason, but we know it's real because we experience its impact. We see it in thought, in decisions, in innovations. The same is true for God. We may not see him directly, but we see his signs everywhere. In the perfect order of the universe. In the precision of natural laws. In the existence of life that came from nothing." A murmur stirred through the crowd. The once cynical expressions began to shift, many now deep in thought. Watkins quickly tried to regain control. "But reason is part of the human mind," he countered. "We know it exists because we use it ourselves. How can you prove that your God exists? How do you know that what you worship is the true one?" Abdurrahman smiled calmly. Professor, do you believe that everything in this world has a cause? Of course, Watkins replied. Then, if you saw a beautiful house with an intricate design, would you believe it appeared out of nowhere, without anyone building it? Of course not, Watkins said, scoffing. Then what about the universe? Abdurrahman asked. Which is far more complex than any house. Abdurrahman's calm question echoed in the hall. Tell me, Professor, how could something as vast and complex as the universe appear without anyone creating it? Watkins fell silent. He scrambled to find a loophole in the argument, trying to twist it to his favor. I can accept that there are natural laws governing the universe, he finally said. But that doesn't prove God exists. It only proves that the universe operates under a system. Abdurrahman leaned forward, quick to respond. Who created that system? Watkins opened his mouth, but no words came out. He shut it again, realizing he was walking straight into the young man's logical trap. Professor, Abdurrahman continued, his tone steady and composed. The Qur'an has laid out this truth more than 1,400 years ago. In Surah At-Tur, verse 35, Allah says, Were they created by nothing? Or were they the creators of themselves? He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the words to settle. This verse directly challenges human reasoning. It is impossible for something to come into being without a cause. And it's equally impossible for something to create itself. So there must be a creator behind it all. The murmurs in the audience began to grow. People were no longer laughing or mocking. Instead, they were starting to genuinely consider the logic. Watkins exhaled slowly, then offered a thin, tense smile. You're clever, he admitted. But this debate is far from over. I still have questions that challenge your religion. Abdurrahman gave a gentle smile and nodded. Please, Professor. I'm ready. The room grew tenser. What had started as a seemingly one-sided show now felt like a real battle of intellects, and Abdurrahman was proving to be no easy opponent. He didn't just speak with conviction, but with reasoning that struck deep. Watkins, despite the pressure, wasn't ready to surrender. As a symbolic figure in the atheist community, a defeat tonight would be a crushing blow to his pride and reputation. He straightened in his seat and glared across the table. All right, he said. Maybe I can't refute your argument about God's existence. But what about your religion? Islam is filled with strange and restrictive rules. Why would a merciful God forbid simple pleasures like eating pork or drinking alcohol? If God created everything, why would he prohibit people from enjoying them? The audience stirred. This was Watkins' domain, challenging the logic behind religious laws. But Abdurrahman didn't even blink. He looked at Watkins and asked, Professor, if someone gave you a luxury car, an expensive, high-end machine, would you treat it carelessly? Of course not, Watkins replied. And if the car's manual clearly stated that the engine must use a specific type of oil, would you ignore that instruction? Of course not, he said again, now frowning slightly. Then why? Abdurrahman asked. When God, the creator of human beings, gives instructions for what's best for our bodies and souls, do you find it strange? Doesn't the creator know best how to care for his creation, just like an engineer knows the machine he designed? Again, the room fell into heavy silence. Watkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Around him, even some of his supporters looked uncertain. Abdurrahman continued. The ban on pork and alcohol is not about limiting pleasure. It's about protecting us. Scientific studies have shown that pork can carry parasites and harmful diseases. Alcohol damages the body, tears apart families, and causes countless accidents. Islam doesn't forbid these things to punish us, but to preserve our health, our dignity, and our communities. Watkins inhaled sharply. He hadn't expected Abdurrahman to respond with scientific reasoning. But what about praying 5 times a day? Watkins challenged. Or fasting for an entire month? Isn't that an unreasonable burden? Why would God make life harder for his followers? Abdurrahman smiled. Professor, if you wanted a healthy and fit body, would you exercise just once a month? Of course not, Watkins replied. Exactly, Abdurrahman said. Praying 5 times a day is spiritual maintenance. Just like physical exercise keeps the body strong, prayer keeps the heart pure and the mind focused. It disciplines the soul. It brings peace, clarity, and connection with the Creator. Even scientific research has shown that the movements in prayer improve blood circulation and reduce stress. Heads in the audience began to nod. People were no longer just watching, they were reflecting. Watkins, growing desperate, grasped for another question. And fasting? Why would a merciful God ask people to starve themselves for a whole month? Isn't that cruel? Abdurrahman took a deep breath and answered with serene confidence. Professor, when you want to cleanse your body of toxins, don't you go through a detox process? Watkins nodded slowly, almost instinctively. Fasting, Abdurrahman said, is both a physical and spiritual detox. Modern science confirms that fasting repairs cells and improves health. But more importantly, it teaches self-restraint. It nurtures empathy and gratitude. Fasting helps us understand the suffering of the poor, people who endure hunger not by choice, but because of their circumstances. The murmurs returned, this time louder, more thoughtful. Watkins could feel the atmosphere shifting. The energy that had once cheered for him now felt unsure, even doubtful. God doesn't give us rules to make our lives difficult, Abdurrahman said, locking eyes with the professor. He gives them because he knows what's best for us. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, the Qur'an says, Allah does not burden a soul more than it can bear. Every command is a path to goodness, not a punishment. Watkins went quiet. He looked like a man who had just been blindsided. After years of debating and humiliating believers, this was the first time someone had countered every one of his arguments, with stronger, sharper logic. He bit his lip, clearly unsettled. He didn't want to lose. He couldn't afford to lose. All right, he finally said, his voice wavering slightly. You've answered well. But there's one last question I want to ask you, Watkins said, his voice low but intense. The entire room seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to Abdurrahman. The question that came next was one that had shaken many people's faith. If God is truly all-powerful and all-good, Watkins began slowly, then why does he allow suffering in this world? The room became quieter than it had ever been. No one moved. No one spoke. Every person held their breath, waiting for Abdurrahman's reply. But the young man simply smiled, as if the question were nothing new to him. Professor, he said gently, have you ever been to a gym? Watkins frowned, unsure where this was going. What do you mean? In the gym, Abdurrahman explained. People lift heavy weights. Their muscles hurt. They strain. They sweat. It's painful, but they do it anyway. Why? Because they know that pain will make them stronger. Watkins stared at him, his expression beginning to shift as he followed the line of reasoning. Life is the same, Abdurrahman continued. Hardship, suffering, they aren't signs of God's absence. They're part of a test. A process of growth. Without pain, we wouldn't develop. Without trials, we'd never mature. God gives us these challenges not to break us, but to raise us higher. The room was silent again, this time not from ridicule, but reflection. And God has promised, Abdurrahman added. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 286, Allah does not burden a soul more than it can bear. Every hardship has a purpose. Every pain is a chance to grow. That's not cruelty, that's love. Watkins gazed at Abdurrahman in awe. For the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar, defeat. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His mind, usually sharp and quick, had no response. The jeering crowd was now silent. Some even appeared visibly moved. And then, a realization struck him like thunder. This entire time, it wasn't Abdurrahman being tested. It was him. Watkins gripped the sides of his chair, his body tense, mind spinning, trying to find one last opening, a weakness to exploit. He couldn't believe that a young, unknown Muslim had deflected every strike with answers that were not only logical, but transformative. "I'm not finished yet," Watkins said in a softer voice. "I have one last question." Abdurrahman nodded calmly. "Go ahead, Professor." Watkins pointed to the same glass of water that had started the debate. "Let's go back to this," he said. "If I pour poison into this glass, the one who drinks it will die. But if I pour honey, it brings health. Do you agree?" "Of course," Abdurrahman replied. "So," Watkins said, leaning forward, "you admit that the contents of this glass determine whether it harms or benefits, yes?" "Yes," Abdurrahman answered again. A small, hopeful smile flickered on Watkins' face, like he believed he'd finally found a flaw. "Then tell me," he pressed, "if God really exists, why does he allow people to fill this world with poison? Why does he let some people become evil, while others are good? If he is all-powerful, why doesn't he stop them before they do harm?" The tension in the room returned. This was it. The question Watkins hoped would turn the debate in his favor. But Abdurrahman didn't flinch. He gently reached for the glass, lifted it, and looked at it for a moment before replying. "Professor," he asked softly, "who is responsible for what goes into this glass?" Watkins blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Abdurrahman clarified, "if someone pours poison into this glass, is the glass at fault? Or the person who poured it?" Watkins was silent. He saw the trap closing in again. "This world," Abdurrahman continued, "was created pure, like this glass of water. God gave us a beautiful, balanced world. But he also gave us free will. He gave us the choice to pour in honey or poison." Watkins opened his mouth to speak, but Abdurrahman wasn't finished. "God did not create robots who can only do good. He gave humans the ability to choose good or evil. That is the very test of life. If he stopped every act of evil before it happened, we would no longer have freedom. And without freedom, goodness would have no meaning." The silence grew heavier, this time with weighty understanding. Even the most stubborn faces in the crowd began to soften. "Imagine," Abdurrahman said, "if every time someone tried to steal, their hand became paralyzed. Or every time someone tried to lie, their mouth shut. Then no one would choose to do good, they'd simply be forced. And forced goodness isn't real goodness at all." Watkins swallowed hard. The analogy hit harder than he expected. "Picture a student during an exam," Abdurrahman went on. "If the teacher gave him all the answers, did the student really learn anything? No. He passed the test, but with no growth, no understanding, no value." Watkins sat still, stunned. Every one of Abdurrahman's words cut through the fog of his thoughts with sharp clarity. "God has given us reason, a heart, and guidance," Abdurrahman said. "He hasn't left us alone. In Surah Al-Insan, verse 3, the Qur'an says, 'Indeed, we guided him to the way, whether he be grateful or ungrateful.'" He looked directly into Watkins' eyes. "God gave us this glass of water. But what we pour into it, honey or poison, is our choice. And one day, we will all be held accountable for what we chose to fill the glass of our lives with." Watkins sat frozen. No words escaped his lips. He stared at the glass, as if seeing it for the first time. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes welled up. The entire hall was hushed. No mocking laughter remained. Even Watkins' most die-hard followers now looked shaken, unsure, almost afraid of what had just unfolded before them. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Joshua Watkins bowed his head. His shoulders trembled. Tears rolled down his cheeks. A gasp echoed from somewhere in the crowd. With a voice that cracked with emotion, Watkins looked up at Abdurrahman, eyes filled not with arrogance or pride, but confusion, vulnerability, and for the first time, humility. "I've spent my whole life," he whispered, "attacking something I never truly understood." His trembling hand reached toward the Qur'an resting on the table. He picked it up slowly, holding it with reverence, and then he hugged it to his chest. He wept. And his followers, those who once cheered every insult, now sat in stunned silence. Some with eyes wide, others wiping tears from their own faces. A shift had occurred in that room, something profound, something eternal. A young Muslim man named Abdurrahman had entered that hall as an underdog. But he walked out as the man who made the proudest atheist bow his head to the truth. The night that began with laughter and mockery had transformed into one of deep silence and reflection. In the center of that hall, before hundreds of witnesses, an arrogant atheist professor had finally submitted to the truth. And it all began with a glass of water. Time seemed to freeze. The hall was completely still. Not a single laugh, not a single whisper, only the soft sound of breath being held in anticipation. Joshua Watkins, once feared for his sharp tongue and intellect, now sat on stage sobbing, the Qur'an clutched tightly to his chest. His eyes were red and swollen, his shoulders trembling as his lips murmured words only he could hear. His followers, once so certain of his victory, sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their intellectual champion, the one they had idolized for years, had been defeated, not by insult or aggression, but by the quiet, unshakable logic of a 24-year-old Muslim named Abdurrahman. Yet Abdurrahman did not gloat. He didn't smile with pride. He simply sat there, looking at Watkins with warmth, not as a rival, but as a brother who had finally found his way home. Watkins slowly raised his head. His eyes were still wet, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by something far more profound: submission. He stared at Abdurrahman with disbelief, as if still trying to grasp what had just taken place inside his soul. He whispered, voice barely audible. "I've spent my life attacking something that turned out to be true." A collective breath was held by the audience. In the front row, a man who had earlier smirked at Abdurrahman now looked down in shame. A woman nearby wiped tears from her cheeks. "I read the Qur'an," Watkins continued, his voice shaking but sincere. "I studied it. I analyzed it. I searched it for flaws. But I never really understood it, until tonight." He glanced at the glass of water still on the table. "I always demanded evidence, something I could see, touch, measure. But I forgot that some of the most real things in life are invisible." Abdurrahman smiled gently. "Like thought," Watkins said. "Like love. Like truth." He paused, then added with a soft nod, "And like God." Suddenly, someone in the audience stood up and shouted, "This has to be a joke. You can't be serious." Watkins looked at the man, eyes still glistening. "I'm more serious now than I have ever been in my life," he said quietly. "I was wrong. All these years I rejected not because I understood God, but because I refused to try." The murmurs of the crowd returned, but now they weren't scoffs. They were whispers of doubt, of reflection. Watkins' followers sat unsettled, watching their leader unravel not in defeat, but in revelation. "Professor," Abdurrahman said softly, "life is a journey. No one is ever too far to turn back. If your heart has found the truth, the next step is to accept it with sincerity." Watkins stared at him with eyes full of clarity, a new light shining through. "I want to read the Qur'an again," he whispered. "Not to challenge it, but to understand it." An older man in the back wiped tears from his wrinkled cheeks. Others who had once mocked Islam now sat deep in thought, some with lips pressed tightly, others with lowered heads. The room was no longer a battlefield of ideas, it had become a sanctuary of reflection. Then, a woman in the front row raised her hand timidly. "Is it possible," she asked, voice trembling, "for me to have a copy of the Qur'an too?" Abdurrahman smiled warmly. "The Qur'an is not only for Muslims. It is a guide for anyone who seeks truth." The same hall that had echoed with mockery now radiated silence and sincerity. Many hearts were moved that night. Many minds began to question their former beliefs. Watkins, eyes still red, reached out and shook Abdurrahman's hand, for the first time, not to debate, but to learn. That night, the crowd of atheist intellectuals didn't just witness a debate, they witnessed a transformation. A proud atheist professor, known for crushing religious thought, had surrendered to a truth greater than himself. And it all started with a single glass of water. The atmosphere had changed completely. Those who once awaited Abdurrahman's defeat now sat in disbelief as they watched their once proud leader hold the Qur'an as if it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. Watkins wiped his tear-streaked face and looked at Abdurrahman, his expression filled with awe, sorrow, and newfound clarity. "I spent my life looking for truth in the wrong places," he said. "I rejected God, not because he didn't exist, but because I never truly tried to understand him." In the front rows, some began to sob. They had expected to see a Muslim humiliated in front of one of the world's sharpest atheists. Instead, they saw that very man bow to something far greater than human pride. Watkins glanced once more at the glass of water. This time, he smiled, not with mockery, but with reverence. "I used to believe I understood everything. But tonight, with just a glass of water, I realized there's something far greater than human reason." He turned to the crowd. "If anyone here is still searching for the truth, read the Qur'an. Read it with an open heart." "I know I will." Abdurrahman said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, his logic, patience, and sincerity had spoken louder than any argument. And though only one man openly embraced the truth, many hearts began to crack under the weight of what they had witnessed. The light had entered, and once it does, no darkness can put it out. This story reminds us, truth is not won by shouting, it is revealed through clarity and sincerity. Abdurrahman didn't use anger or emotion. He used calm, reasoned thought and unwavering faith. It also reminds us that sometimes the greatest obstacle to truth is pride. Joshua Watkins was a brilliant thinker, but for years his own ego blinded him. Until one night, when a young man reminded him that truth is greater than intellect, and that belief is not weakness, but wisdom. And finally, this story teaches that even the simplest things, a glass of water, can carry the deepest lessons. Because truth doesn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes, it just needs a sincere heart, a quiet mind, and the courage to listen.